Hello, I'm Joanna Espin. I'm curator at the Postal Museum, and today we're going to be looking at the secretive and rebellious language of stamps. But before we look at this rule-breaking code, let's take a look at how to do things properly. Victorian etiquette manuals advised letter writers on how to correctly position a stamp on an envelope. Remember that the world's first self-adhesive postage stamp, the penny black, was only born in 1840, so letter writers might have needed some advice on how to do things correctly. In 1875, one such letter writing expert advised its readers to place stamps in the top right corner of an envelope. And 5 years later, another etiquette guide went further to say that placing a stamp anywhere else on an envelope or at an awkward angle was careless and also disrespectful to the person you were writing to. So what started the postage stamp rebellion? Well, we've found 3 possible origin stories to the language of stamps in our research. Firstly, it could have been a mystical tradition drawing on popular Victorian and Edwardian trends like reading tea leaves. And according to this origin story of the language of stamps, the sender of an envelope would inadvertently place their stamp, and the slight angle at which they'd placed that stamp would reveal something about their personality or their true intentions for writing or the real nature of your relationship with the sender. So this kind of mystical study in a domestic setting was really popular in the Edwardian period, and you could buy manuals to understand a whole host of occult studies in domestic settings. As I mentioned, reading tea leaves is a really popular and well-known one, but there were also studies on cutting fingernails and its luck, dominoes and good luck, mirrors, and also the secret meaning behind sneezes. Secondly, a tilted stamp could indicate to the receiver of a letter that hidden underneath the stamp itself was a secret and very tiny message. And according to a Nottinghamshire newspaper in 1922, many a tender message had been sent in this way between lovers. Finally, there was the possibility of using the stamp itself to express the varying degrees of your passion for the person you were writing to. And in 1894, a newspaper article stated that lots of young couples were using this secret language of stamps to send messages under the eyes of their stern but uninitiated parents, who unwittingly didn't realise that this correspondence and secret message writing was going on. Also, sending the language of stamps in this way could be hiding secret messages from postal officials. For example, if you're using a postcard, which is a very open format of communication, the postmen themselves wouldn't know, perhaps if they weren't initiated into the secret language of stamps, exactly what you were actually saying. The first reference that we found printed in UK newspapers referencing the language of stamps was in a Scottish and also Irish newspaper in 1879, which reported that the language of stamps had been invented by a so-called practical American. There's nothing else in that article, unfortunately, that we've been able to find about the intentions behind this practical American's motives or how the code was being used at that time. But we have also found a reference to the code being used in the United States in the mid-1870s. And that's in a lovely story reported to have happened in Philadelphia in 1874. One Sunday, I was desperately struck with the appearance of a young lady who sat in the pew on the opposite side of the aisle to me. Never mind about the details. After some inquiries, I found out who she was, but could not obtain an introduction. I got from a friend of mine some information about the postage stamp language and the language of flowers. Every Sunday morning, I managed to get to church in time to place a small bouquet of flowers in her pew, together with an empty envelope with a stamp affixed in a certain way. After a while, she discovered who her unknown admirer was. What is more, she also learned the stamp language, and in return, she would leave an envelope stamped in the pew for me. This silent courtship proceeded for nearly 8 months, when one lucky day I found an acquaintance who knew the family. I need not tell you that I very soon became acquainted too. To make a very long story short, the lady is now my wife. So what did the General Post Office, the GPO, make of the language of stamps? Which would actually slow down the process of sorting letters, because if they weren't all placed in the top right-hand corner, sorters would have to take a lot more time to hand sort these envelopes and this mail. Well, in 1910, a report emerged where the Austrian government threatened to confiscate any type of mail which used the language of stamps. And in reaction, a GPO spokesman said that yes, it is wearying to have to sort this type of mail, but that he mustn't say too much about it because he remembers being young. So at that point in time, 1910, there was almost an benevolent, indulgent approach to people who were using this form of communication. In 1917, 7 years later, this official line had changed, perhaps because of the First World War, which put pressure on the postage system. The official line at this point was that the post office has no sympathy with the language of stamps because of the effect it had on slowing down the sorting of mail. So serious was the impact of the language of stamps on the postage system that in 1935, Postmaster General Sir Kingsley Wood declared a campaign against the language of stamps, trying to slow down this form of communication or stop it altogether. And this was amplified yet again during the Second World War, when it was proclaimed that the language of stamps and the time delay involved in sorting this mail would lead to wasted labour, wasted transport and delay to dispatches. So in wartime, there's really no sympathy for the shy sweethearts who were using this form of communication. The heyday of the language of stamps was perhaps the early 20th century, when the language of stamps, along with a host of other types of languages of secret meanings, were printed onto pictorial postcards in so many places across the world. This includes Europe, Russia, and also the United States. In France, for example, you could look at the secret code of perfume, the secret code of kissing, the secret code of hair, even the secret code of matches. And as I said, all of these would be printed onto postcards and shared and sent through the post. In Italy, you could communicate through the secret language of rings. In Norway, you could communicate through the secret language of flowers. In America, there was a language for playing cards. And it led to one reporter to say that there was a language for almost everything under the sun. Some of the codes circulating in the United Kingdom may seem familiar to modern audiences, such as clover for good luck or red roses for love, but how about yellow roses for falseness? Confusion could occur through double meanings. So for example, that clover which we mentioned just a moment ago could also mean be mine. So you have to make sure that if you are communicating through one of these secret languages, that you're both using the same key code to understand what you actually mean. And be careful with what you serve up for dinner, because according to one secret language of vegetables, those carrots could actually be communicating, I'm ready. So what struck us when we were researching these secret languages was the parallels between how Victorians, Edwardians, were communicating with how young people might communicate today, for example, with the double meanings around emojis. Manufacturers would print updated and revised versions of these language of stamp postcards, language of vegetable postcards, language of flower postcards, as new generations of consumers bought into the fun. So let's have a look at a few examples of the ways that historical couples have used the language of stamps. We found a report from the 1890s about a couple who managed to orchestrate a young girl's escape from a convent in Bohemia, which is situated in modern-day Czech Republic, entirely by using the language of stamps. And apparently both of the people in this relationship were so well versed into what the varying angles and tilts of these stamps meant that they managed to successfully pull off an escape from a convent and we assume ultimately start a relationship together. Slightly less positive story, this time occurring in 1909 during a breach of promise hearing, which is where an engagement between two people has been called off. The lady in the relationship was called Charlotte Jacobs, and she was upset that Moses Goodman, her former fiancé, had called off their engagement. And during the hearing, it was heard that Moses had previously written to Charlotte using the language of stamps on one of his envelopes. But she had interpreted this quite badly and thought that he was being sarcastic through the placement of his stamp. And the newspaper reports that we have found do poke fun at this, and apparently the people in the court, they did find this quite amusing, that Charlotte had been quite upset about the language of stamps. And apparently the person hearing this evidence said, so there is a language of stamps between young people. And finally, not a story that's romantic at all, but we found evidence that the language of stamp has been used for political protest. So in the late Victorian period in Scotland, British legitimists would place the stamp upside down. At that time it would be Queen Victoria on the stamp, and that was a sign of protest against the current ruling monarch. Detractors called the language of stamps nonsense and branded anyone taking part in the code an idiot, but it was clearly a large and important part of the culture of letter writing across 3 continents for many, many years. It was printed in pamphlets, in books, and on pictorial postcards, and also obviously utilised by many, many people as well. We would love to hear what type of secret messages you're sending, whether it's language of stamps type of code or emojis or any other form of secret communication. We'd love to hear about it in the comments below.